When we come to think about studying psychology, counseling, engaged humanities, mythological studies, oftentimes we think about the roles that are already set out in the society that we can get jobs in. In psychology, that's primarily being a therapist or teaching undergraduates or graduate students doing research. But tonight I want to open up that geography of vocations, using a lot of examples of students' work here over the years to give you some sense of the diversity of the ways in which people who are schooled in depth psychology, in mythological studies, engaged humanities, the range of work that they can do. And we began this really 20 years ago. We began an experiment here, which was instead of just having the counseling program and the clinical program, we created the depth program and the mythological studies program, where there wasn't a clear avenue to becoming licensed as a psychologist, but we had students try to tune into what their passion was in the world around them. And that could be something that they felt very deeply about, that they felt they wanted to advocate for, that they were moved by, disturbed by. And we invited them to do field work during the course of their studies, and to take what they were learning out into the world, but also to immerse themselves within community situations to see if somebody who is psychologically minded could be of any use whatsoever. So I want to give you a little bit of sense of the map that's evolved of some of that work. I've been it's been a great richness in my life to witness students who come sometimes with some hints and guesses about the life change that they want to make in their vocational life. And sometimes they come with very clear ideas about what they want to do. But to see how they are able to blend their education with their autobiography, to be able to set out on a very particular path of work. And in doing so, get the world to respond to them such that they create a role for themselves that their community, and I'm going to include their bioregion, needs. So I want us to begin to think less about fulfilling the roles that are there and more about creating the roles that we really feel are needed within our communities, if we're honest with ourselves and look around to the kinds of suffering and issues that people are dealing with. How many of you are going to the information day tomorrow? Okay, so I'm going to have you do an active imagination that would be appropriate if you were thinking about entering into another phase of schooling, but you could also use it in your life just as it is without considering coming to graduate school. So if you'll just close your eyes for a moment and take some deep breaths. We're going to try to put the traffic behind us and really come into the present moment with your breath through focusing on your breath. You don't have to worry about what happened today or what's going to happen tomorrow. Just going to begin to be present with yourself. Now, in your life so far, what has been the most personally fulfilling work, paid or volunteer, that you have ever done in your life? Just think back across all the various things you've done. And what comes forward as being something that was just deeply fulfilling? Now imagine yourself back in the period of your life when you were doing this, and try to recall what you felt about that activity and about yourself as you were enjoying it. And ask yourself, what were the most satisfying and fulfilling aspects of what you were doing? What was it about this that really moved you? And then take a few breaths. Keep your eyes closed, if you will. A few breaths into your heart. Open up your heart space a little further. And ask yourself, what is it you know about the work that you want to do in the next chapter of your life? You may have just little hints and guesses about it, or it may be a full-blown image that you have. And then imagine yourself 5 years from now, and you're deeply involved in the work that you were imagining tonight. Allow yourself to be surprised about where you are as you imagine this and what exactly it is you're doing. What does it feel like? What do you see? And then ask yourself, what do I need to make the transition to this next chapter of my vocational life, of the work that I'm meant to do here? What do I need? And when you're ready, come back gently to the room. And take those images like little seeds and put them in your pocket so you can further plant and grow them. When we got started on this experiment at Pacifica about what kinds of vocations people imagined and then brought to fruition alongside doing clinical work or instead of doing clinical work, we were about 8 years into it when I found a book by a woman named Ellen Danto, and it's called Free Clinics. And in this book, she talks about the early clinics, psychoanalytic clinics in Berlin and Vienna right after the First World War. But more importantly for my purposes tonight, she talks about the parallel work that depth psychologists during that period were doing outside of the clinic doors. And they were involved, the analysts were quite involved politically. Some of them were Marxists, socialists, social democrats. They were involved in their neighborhoods. They were involved in the inner cities where they lived. And the range of work they did was really pretty extraordinary. Now, you have to realize that depth psychology was conceived in an atmosphere of acute consciousness of social inequalities and their impact on mental health and the provision of psychological treatment. So when psychoanalysts were trying to understand the suffering that people were undergoing after the First World War, they couldn't help but notice that poverty and having been exposed to violence had profound effects on mental health, and particularly on the mental health of children. And so the early psychoanalysts were very involved in creating the first kindergartens, in getting the kindergarten movement going. They were involved in creating free clinics for psychoanalytic treatment, free clinics for reproductive health care and education for women, sexual education for women, initiatives to help women struggle against various forms of domination and control and domestic violence. They created experimental schools for inner city children, school-based treatment centers for children traumatized by war and poverty. They created settlement houses where they gave classes to workers. They created the first child guidance clinics, suicide prevention centers. They gave their attention to what would be necessary to create conditions for peace and stability in Austria and in Europe more widely. And they even consulted with architects in terms of how to build public housing so that instead of families being segmented and separated, isolated from each other, the space would be conducive to creating communities of families that could offer mutual aid and support to one another. Now, I found it very interesting that I had been studying psychology and teaching psychology for 30 years before I read this book, and in nothing I was taught was this early history underlined. And so I got very curious about why that was. And so I'm going to tell you what I found out, which was these analysts, as I said, mainly in Berlin and Vienna, many of them were Jewish, and as the Second World War began to unfold and the Holocaust began to play out, many of them came to the United States. And what they found in the United States was a very, very different approach to mental health and to psychological health. We in the States live in what is dominantly a highly individualistic society, where our own well-being is thought to accrue from our own efforts and not to have that much to do with what we've been going through. And the treatment in the US that they encountered was a highly medicalized treatment, so that psychology was really addressing diseases and pathologies, and the treatment providers were more valued if they were medical professionals. Whereas in Europe, Freud had been advocating for lay professionals, people schooled in literature and history, who knew something about the politics of the day and the social circumstances, and who were clearly understanding that we can't separate what goes on in our interior life from what's going on in the culture around us, what Fanon called sociogeny. So when they got to the United States, they were entering a period of McCarthyism, where if you had a background that was committed to a socialist vision of society, or to a vision that a society needs to take care of its most vulnerable, and to address the conditions that are bringing down both the physical and psychological health of its members, if they had followed through on what they were doing in Europe, would have very, very soon landed into McCarthy's wide net. And so many of the analysts actually created a secret code so that they could talk amongst themselves in letters about what they were doing without it looking suspicious if those letters were ever found in terms of their attention to social dynamics. But because of their many losses, many of their own families affected by the Holocaust, they kept a low profile. They entered into the medical field. They became psychiatrists, most of them, and entered into the medicalized practice of psychology and psychiatry. And in doing so, we lost the possibility in the United States for a much more integrated understanding of what psychological health is. So I want to contrast this kind of very individualistic view of the self, where human development is seen, the young child is seen as developing the more he or she develops a sense of mastery and control, differentiates him or herself from other people, follows a competitive path and excels, even if that leads to feelings of isolation and loneliness. Of course, there are differences in what boys are socialized into versus what girls are socialized into. But I want to contrast that with what we might call an interdependent model of the self, where we see the self as a much more porous entity, where the health of our family, of our school system, of our neighborhood, the health of our bioregion, of our trees, of our water, all feed into how I'm able to be and do in my life. When you have that kind of interdependent view about psychological health, then as a psychologist or a mythologist, you could effect change on many different levels of organization. You could work in a school system, you could work in a neighborhood center, you could work in a returning center for veterans, you could work in advocacy for a river or against mercury pollution coming from coal plants. There would be many, many levels of access, which I'll give you some examples of. But for me, this interdependent view of the self began to make sense as I read about what's called psychiatric epidemiology. So if you look across cultures, where is the highest incidence of psychological distress? And it's for people who are living in very particular kinds of situations, and it shouldn't surprise us what they are. Poverty, but in particular, situations of poverty where the division between the very rich and the very poor is quite extreme, and is something that people who are consigned to lower levels of economic well-being witness every day, not only in the media, but just by walking through the city and seeing schools with rooftop gardens and schools with crumbling infrastructure and windows. People who have had to migrate, forced migration. Diane alluded to the book Up Against the Wall. I've been working for the last decade on forced migration from Mexico, but that's connected me with the fact that we're living in a world right now that has more people crossing national borders than we've ever seen. If we took all the forced migrants together and put them into a country, it would be the size of Brazil. And it's for many different reasons, for violence that's happening, that people are fleeing, wars, civil wars, but also environmental degradation and poverty. Also, when you look at psychiatric epidemiology, it clearly points to the fact that racism, sexism, homophobia are stressors for people. And what begins to happen when you look that way is that instead of looking at trauma as something that's individual, we need to begin to look at trauma as something that happens collectively, what's called social trauma, where whole communities are living under sets of circumstances that are compromising to their health and well-being. So I tried to begin to, as I've been listening to the work that's been evolving here over the last 20 years, I tried to begin to see what would be meaningful ways to sort it in terms of the kinds of categories that people are deeply involved in to be able to address these kinds of situations. And in doing that, I became deeply familiar with a parallel document to the Declaration of Human Rights, the Earth Charter. The Earth Charter is a very interesting document. It was drafted through a very consensual process over many years, over many countries. It included many indigenous groups. And unlike the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it focuses not just on the rights of humans, human rights, but it focuses on human responsibilities and the rights not only of humans, but the rights of nature. And you have a copy of the preamble and the articles. They fall into 4 categories: respect and care for the community of life, ecological integrity, social and economic justice, democracy, nonviolence, and peace. And I began to see that using this, I could begin to sort the work that has evolved here into these various categories. And we can give you the web link for this if you like. You can see that you can click on these various things and they take you into the world of these particular kinds of projects. But I'm going to give you a few examples of them. We want to, again, think about these 4 categories as interdependent. There are lots of pieces of work that you would kind of put across the categories. But we begin to see that if we try to imagine the kinds of roles that are needed in our society, many of them fall within these categories, because the vision is that in order to have democracy, nonviolence, and peace, there has to be social and economic justice, and there has to be ecological integrity, or else the next set of wars will be over water and resources. We have many wars already over some resources. And that underlying all of those, there has to be a core component that honors the dignity of each person and that creates community settings, what I call, and Mary Belinkie and Bell Hooks calls, public home places, where in the midst of trauma, in the aftermath of trauma, there are safe places created where people have loving, caring relationships with each other, where they have the space to develop some critical consciousness about the situations that they're undergoing, and where they have enough psychic space to begin to dream about the way they want to live their life and begin to be able to work together to bring that about. And that's why I started initially with that, the mural of what I call the Dreaming Woman. That mural is from a high school building in Chiapas, Mexico, in one of the Mayan indigenous communities, Zapatista communities, and people could congregate and decide what they were going to be doing in their neighborhood, what the basic values were that were fueling their advocacy. Another of our students is Stephen Jones. He's actually an alum now. And Stephen, there's Alyssa. Okay. Stephen, in his field work here, worked in a hospice, and he began to fall in love with tending people who were dying. In his second year of field work, he apprenticed himself to an undertaker, which was a very, very difficult situation, and learned how to prepare bodies after death. And he began to work at one of the jewels in Santa Barbara, a social hospice here, Sarah House. What makes this place very, very unique is that it's a place that is open to anybody who has no financial resources, and it becomes a haven for them in the last days, weeks, or months of their life. It's truly an incredible place to go and visit, because everyone who works there tries to provide each of the residents with whatever it is they want. It can be an outrageous thing, like I want a vanilla milkshake at 2 o'clock in the morning. But people are trying to not judge what people are asking for or wanting, but to be available to them, to accompany them in this life transition. Stephen is now the house manager of Sarah House, and has been there, I think, about 8 or 9 years. This would be a beautiful example of a public home place. Now, in the Mythological Studies program, we have an alum, Kwame Scruggs, who lives in Cincinnati and works with inner city youth there. And I want to give him the chance to describe his work in his own words, if I can.
I have my uncle. I mean, that's kind of my biggest male influence. He sells drugs. Everything he do is wrong. I got the aspect as I can't do shit. I'm gonna be a statistic.
Hey, thanks for sharing that. He who conceals his disease cannot expect to be cured.
That's Kwame.
What we attempt to do is recreate the temple of Asclepius. Instead of chanting, we drum. Instead of healing through dreams, we heal through the myth.
That journey to another place, long, long ago.
I never been able to just be a normal kid growing up. And hearing the wet snake myth, I felt like that was me.
You're coming out of your comfort zone, completely new person.
And all of a sudden, the body fell out and it fell into a hole.
Either he had a death wish or he was running an experiment on how fast a black man would turn his car around when angry.
I threatened a kid. I just took it real far a couple times. There's times where I wouldn't say anything.
If you meet any college athlete, ask them to stop the blue. If football stops, what would you do? This ain't right. This ain't, oh no, come on man, I got some stuff to say, dog.
They talk about the black male code, that's still real. My hat's down, I turn it backward so they see my face.
Other people's low expectations gives me something to push against, makes me try harder.
You have been prepared to face this monster that you're running into now. I hope you don't think you wasn't supposed to face it.
How can we really expose us to the young men in the group, our worth, our value in society? We were working with the 7th grade boys the other day and seeing them identify some of the things in the myth. It's just something that so many people don't have.
These myths, I can see it in myself. They're embedded in my thinking.
How can we show people that we are the heroes?
So Kwame has worked with now hundreds and hundreds of young people using myth and story as the way to help them reflect on their life. So I want to go to the next column, Ecological Integrity, and give you a couple of examples there. The first is a woman who had a doctorate when she came to Pacifica in mathematics and I think linguistics also. And as she was studying human trauma theory, being very, very knowledgeable about animals, she realized that usually in psychological research, we're taking animal studies and extrapolating from them to psychology, to humans. But she realized that we could go the other way, so that when you looked at many of the things that were causing human communities to be traumatized, like loss of habitat and forced displacement and violence, that many, many animal communities were now encountering those particular things. Elephants were being culled, they were losing their habitat, their family members were being separated through culling, etc. So she began to talk about collective trauma of animal communities at this particular time of mass extinction. And when she finished school, she created her own institute called Keralos Institute, which has many functions. The first thing that she worked on was a book that you may have seen called Elephants on the Edge, about the fate of elephant communities. She then got very interested in parrot communities and tortoise communities. She turned her home into a tortoise shelter. So if you go to her place, there are lots of tortoises that have been injured and needed a place. She works with sanctuaries throughout the world and has developed curriculum for people who want to study particular species and then work in either sanctuaries or in natural habitats with the kinds of issues that are facing those communities. So a lot of the work happens with indigenous communities that are focused in particular on a particular species. she's also working with some indigenous communities to create memorials for species that have sadly disappeared during our lifetime. Any questions or comments so far? Are you with me? Okay. This is Michael Quill, and when he came, he was somebody who loved to be in the water, and he volunteered planting kelp in Santa Monica Bay to restore the kelp forest there. And during that time, the Marine Protection Act began to have an impact on fishermen people coming out of Santa Monica Bay, and he was hired by something called Waterkeeper to go out onto the ocean and to begin to talk with fisher people who were fishing in the wrong place. Obviously, those could be very heated dialogues, potentially, because people have to fish to support their families. But he used the dialogical methods that he was learning here of counsel, appreciative inquiry, of how you create dialogue amongst groups that are divisively divided for different reasons. And so he had a spectacular talent at actually befriending the fisher people instead of alienating them, and beginning to try to find common cause with them to save the bay. Because without creating the protective zone, the fishing stock was going to dwindle anyway. Well, he began to get promoted in this organization, and they wanted him to begin to go upstream into the communities in LA that were putting toxic waste into the sewers and gutters that was then showing up in Santa Monica. So he started creating neighborhood education campaigns for the teenagers about how you follow water, how you follow the fate of water, what the relationship between your neighborhood is and what's happening in Santa Monica Bay. And in doing that, he discovered that very few of the kids he met had ever been to Santa Monica Bay or even to the beach in LA. And so he began to take them out on the boat, enlist them to start replanting the kelp and talking with the fisher people, and beginning to create a much more fluid back and forth between Santa Monica, the bay, the ocean, and these inner city neighborhoods. Now he also had a classmate named Harry Grammer, who I'm going to speak of in a moment, and he also took a lot of the youth that Harry was working with out on that boat, and they really loved it. So in the third column, we get to social and economic justice. And I'm going to tell you the story of Madeleine Spenser. She's writing her dissertation now, and she has been a real creator, along with many others in Santa Ana, to create a very different sense of municipal government and participatory budgeting. She was involved in the Occupy movement in Santa Ana, and as you may remember from reading about the Occupy movement or being part of it, one of the things that happened at the various encampments was that homeless people began to camp with the occupiers. And this created some challenges, because a lot of the people who were creating the Occupy movement knew very little about mental health, and a lot of the homeless had mental health issues. They also had many, many other issues because they were living on the streets and didn't have adequate medical care, etc. And so Madeleine realized that this was an opportunity to educate Santa Ana about what homeless people go through in that town. First of all, she discovered that through all the rest of that county, the police and others pick up homeless people in other places, and they drive them to Santa Ana and dump them there, where there are very, very few beds for homeless people. And she began to be able to track how that was happening, how people were now very far away from where they had intended themselves to be, and often without any familial or friendly contact at all. So she said, okay, let's get together and create a camp where the needs of the homeless people are first studied. That is, people have the chance to speak up about what it is they actually need rather than having people project onto them what they think they might need. And then let's create an encampment for 7 days that meets those needs. We can't do it forever because we don't have the resources, but we can show the city of Santa Ana what it would look like if people had shelter to stay in, if they had food, if they had medical care, if they had social work assistance if they needed it, if they had a way to develop a political voice so that they could talk directly to the city council about the kinds of changes that were needed to address their needs. And so that's what she and her colleagues did. And in doing that, they created this organization called Sacred, which began to then act on other agendas, including participatory budgeting. And I don't know how many of you are aware of the participatory budgeting movement, but instead of people away from us deciding how tax dollars should be spent, many cities have created a kitty where the residents and citizens of that community can begin to express their priorities for how they want the money spent so that there's more input. So she's been working on these kinds of initiatives, which have taken skills that she's learned here in terms of community organizing, locating community assets, creating community networks, developing participatory research strategies that are not a person researching the community, but investing the community with the skills to answer their own questions through participatory research. Now, we get to Harry. Harry came to Pacifica with a love of hip-hop and a love of poetry and a difficult early life himself. He and his wife began to visit the juvenile youth authorities and to imagine a program there where kids were introduced to poetry and hip-hop as a way to tell their life story, to tell their autobiography, to dream themselves into the future. And they were very smart about the way they did it. They crafted it so that it met the needs for the public education school credits for English, so that it became a key core part of the curriculum in, I'd say, 75% of the youth authorities in Los Angeles. And as you may know, that we have more incarcerated youth in Los Angeles than any other city in the world. So he spent some years developing a group of teachers who could creatively engage kids through the arts and sometimes turning their poetry into songs, recording their songs, performing them, and beginning to feel that there was something beautiful about words. He called his work flow, the fluent love of words. Now, as he pursued his work here, he realized that his own life change had come when he was in contact with nature. And so he began to imagine for his field work what it would be like to take youth right when they got out of the youth authority, instead of having them back into the neighborhood where they could be once again in a dangerous situation. He had seen some kids get killed within the week that they returned to their neighborhood. He began to take young people into nature for a retreat, really using nature and the circle as the therapeutic forces, trying to help the young person be called beyond what they knew to something that they wanted to go toward, really trying to bring out their vision that life could be something different from what they had yet experienced. So this year, he's now in his 4th year. One of the most exciting things I've heard of all summer has happened, which is he was desperately concerned about the kids coming out and not having the kind of resources that they needed to find jobs, to deal with addictions, to deal with psychological issues, and to get a good education. So he's partnered with a charter school in Los Angeles, and they've created a high school program for recently incarcerated youth that will be opening in September with 150 young people. Really amazing achievement. So one of our students for her fieldwork did a photo voice project with the young people. Photo voice is a way of using photography for people to be able to tell their stories to each other and to their community. And these were some of the photographs that came out of that, done by Sula Pefkaras and the youth themselves. Now, democracy, nonviolence, and peace was that fourth column over there. And one of the initiatives at Pacifica has been working with an organization called the Alternatives to Violence Project. And it's a project that was developed some years ago after the Attica prison riots in New York State, developed by prisoners themselves in conjunction with some Quakers who were working in the prison. A judge in New York had wanted to enlist people who had been inside to counsel younger people who were coming into the prison, and to also go into the community and try to educate young people about nonviolence as a life alternative. Now, one day I was driving back from a prison about 5 hours from here, having done some of those workshops with the woman who is in charge of Alternatives to Violence here in California, Pat Hardy. And I said, well, what do you really need to take this to the next step in California? And she said, we need another 30 facilitators. And all of a sudden I thought of all the Pacifica students and graduate students, and I thought, aha, I can do something about this. So we started a training program here for people to be able to facilitate alternatives to violence, which happens not just in prisons, but also in schools. I've been involved in one project in Philadelphia where we took a school of 500 kids and 50 staff and trained everybody in alternatives to violence for 4 days to try to make a culture change in the school. Well, alternatives to violence gradually kind of crept into different places in the world, and one of the places it's developed is in East Africa. And it was took root after the genocide in Rwanda and Burundi, and was crafted. A lot of it was taken whole, but a lot of it was crafted to create what I call sites of reconciliation for neighbors who had found themselves on opposite sides during the genocide, but who now have to live again next to each other. There's been a long process of how do you begin to talk again? How do you share what happened at each other's hands? And so one of our students, Lizzie Rodriguez, went to, let me see if I can get it here, went to Rwanda to do this work called Healing and Rebuilding Our Communities, to learn this methodology. And we have now 2 more students there this summer right now in Rwanda, and we had 2 last summer. So I want to just share with you something she created. Hallelujah, nitasifu kufika mbinguni, Hosanna nitaingia kwa shangwe, nitaingia lango lake na sifa moyoni, nitaingia kwa shangwe.
In the summer of 2012, 80 community members of Quill, a small village in Rwanda, participated in the Healing and Rebuilding Our Communities Trauma Healing Workshop. The HEROF workshop brought together survivors and perpetrators of the 1994 genocide, focusing on healing the wounds of trauma and reconciling with one another in an effort to live together peacefully.
wanameifanya, nitafurahi kufika mbinguni.
In 2013 and 2014, I returned to Rwanda to interview graduates of the HEROC program for a research and program evaluation measuring the sustainable impact the HEROC workshop has on individual and community well-being. This participatory action research utilized indigenous methodologies, partnering with local community members in the co-creation of research methods and evaluation questions within a hermeneutic phenomenological approach of cultural compatibility. The question of describe how you felt about your relationship with your family may be taboo, so
if you can find a way, you can just you can make that question general.
Yeah.
So tell me how your relationship has been.
Okay.
So like in the States we have immediate family, but your Abaturani is like a family. They're the people you ask for sugar, the people that help you with your...
You know how to say that, you know?
Abaturani.
Yes.
Research methods utilized were primarily storytelling through narrative inquiry via interviews receiving personal testimony from participants. Methodologies chosen were relevant within this indigenous, culturally specific setting.
Ubwo rero mu bushobozi Imana impaye mu by'ukuri mbere yo kwita ku wundi muntu umwana wanjye niwe mba ntekereza. Ibyo ni byo nkunda, nuko mu bushobozi Imana impaye mbega ngafasha abana nkabatekera nuko ntawe pe urebye n'utuntu tuba tudafatika. Mu buzima busanzwe mbega urebye nta murimo abantu bafite ufatika umugera ku wundi.
Research results show 95% of participants reported an increase in both individual and community well-being. Mediation and community court cases have decreased, while community building projects have increased. And 98% expressed interest for in-depth training to continue the healing process within their communities.
So Lizzie now brought those skills home here to Santa Barbara, and she's one of the co-directors of Violence Solutions here in Santa Barbara, and that organization works across the county to help people learn about mediation and also establishing restorative justice programs in the school and the courts. We were just up in Guadalupe where they were able to get a grant to offer mediation to families, and not just for families to mediate in families, but to help families learn the processes of mediation so that they have those as skills to use in situations of conflict. Another student, Shelley Stratton, who also was in Rwanda, lives in New Hampshire, and what she did when she came home was she began to see that all around her in Manchester, New Hampshire, were refugees from Africa whom she had just been walking by, not even really realizing. And so she began to work in one of their nonprofits and create a link between families and the school system, because the families had not had very much communication with teachers and principals. And she began to be a middle person, really, a cultural broker between the Sudanese community there and the government, the civic government, and the school system. So you can see that these people are acting as bridge people in a way between communities. And I'll give you one last example, then I'll conclude. And this is John Becknell, one of our alums, who began his career as an emergency medical technician and very quickly realized the amount of trauma that EMTs and firefighters go through. And so he began to use the psychological training he was getting to begin to simply put EMTs and firefighters into groups, and policemen also, so that they could talk and share their experiences with each other. And when they did that, they began to develop very deep bonds that helped them support each other in the kind of terrible situations that they often found themselves in. He now goes across the United States providing that kind of startup to cities and towns that want to support their first responders. But at the same time, in doing that work, he met a lot of veterans who are in those roles who were carrying enormous amount of trauma. And he began to study different ways of greeting veterans as they return home to the community. And one method that really moved him was created by a psychiatrist named Edward Tick of depth psychological persuasion. It's called Soldier's Heart. And Edward Tick was imagining that our approach to returning veterans was really quite wrong-headed, that it, like I was explaining in the earlier part of my talk, takes a very pathologizing view, you know, assuming that people have PTSD and then treating them in individual psychotherapy. Instead, he tried to take a community approach, and he said, look, we're the community. We sent these young people to war. Now we need to sit down with them and learn from them what they learned by going where we sent them. And he created a retreat communities of 3, 4, 5 days where there would be some people like John, psychologically minded people, returning vets, older vets, maybe a few social workers, but ordinary citizens who were willing to do the hard work of listening to some really terrible stories that people had to tell and that needed to be held by a community and not just by an individual person. And oftentimes the groups would begin with vets, you know, not wanting to say a thing, but gradually people beginning to share more and more. And that work took him to Vietnam, where, as you are probably aware, there are a number of initiatives to help American soldiers from the Vietnam War time return to the places where they did battle or served time, and to create bridges with the people who live in those communities who actually lost loved ones, or who may have had loved ones who had injured or killed, compatriots of our soldiers. And so this is such a meeting in a small village in Vietnam where one of the soldiers that he was accompanying had spent time. All right, so I hope that these give you a sense of the kind of broad set of places in which psychological knowledge and psychological skills and practices can be brought to bear. That if we imagine broadly, that work happens within the consulting room, but it can happen in many, many places beyond the consulting room. And in fact, in many community settings where psychotherapy itself is either not available or not actually seen culturally as something that people would really want to be all that much involved in. The practices that I'm describing, such as Lizzie was talking about in her research report, are what we call participatory and dialogical practices, so that instead of an expert having the solutions and letting people know what the solutions are, it's more of a practice of being with, being alongside, studying together, talking together, and moving forward through more consensual methods. Okay, I'm going to stop. Can I take some questions or comments from you all?